Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you for listening. I hope this show is something that you'll look forward to checking in with every week. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, Gardening Utah aims to inspire you and keep you in the know of what tasks you should be accomplishing in your yard and meet amazing, informative experts along the way. This show airs on the radio on the weekends here in Utah at 10 a.m. on 860 AM KKAT, and episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. On today's show, we're going to answer your spring garden questions. We asked our listeners and fans to send us a message on either Instagram at Gardening Utah or our Facebook page and ask your most burning spring garden question, and we are going to get those answered today. There were so many questions we could not get to all of them, but I tried to answer the questions that were really similar to what a lot of different people asked as well. So there's so much to get to in this episode, so let's get into it right away. But first, let's go to the tip of the week.
860 KKAT. With your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is, now is the time to divide perennials that bloom in the fall. Fall blooming perennials include plants like asters, stone crops like autumn joy sedum, goldenrod, blue mist, any kind of chrysanthemum, Russian sage, coreopsis, and catmints. Now, generally, fall blooming perennials should be divided in the spring, and perennials that flower in the spring or summer should be divided in the fall. And dividing perennials, which is generally a form of propagating a plant, outside of their flowering seasons allows the plant to put all of their energy toward healthy root and leaf growth. So what are the benefits? Well, perennial division is a cost-effective way to increase the number of flowering plants in your garden. And after all, dividing perennials will give you 2 or 3 times the number of plants. It also may reinvigorate the plant if it's never been divided before, because you get a chance to remove all of the dead spots. Now, how do you divide them? Well, first, gently dig them up from the ground. My favorite is to use a garden fork, but you can also use a sharp spade as well, and just gently lift the plant out of the dirt. Then go through, remove all of the loose soil around the roots, and this is the great time to cut out any dead spots. Then carefully just tease those root clumps apart into pieces. And if it's big enough, it can be divided into a few smaller sections. Just make sure that each section has several strong shoots and a healthy amount of roots per clump to make sure that you're giving it a good start for the new plant. You might be able to use your hands to just pull the roots apart, or you may need maybe a knife or a small garden spade for tougher, more fibrous rooted perennials. Now, take the new smaller clumps and just plant them into the ground. I like to replant one of the sections in the original location, but you can use other perennial divisions anywhere else in your garden you like, or share them with family, friends, or neighbors. But be sure to keep the same soil level as it was on the original larger clump, because planting them too deep can cause root rot and lots of other problems. So once they're planted back into the ground, you want to cut back any top growth to maybe 2 to 4 inches high and water them well and get them growing.
And that's your Gardening Utah tip of the week, brought to you by the Advocates. If you're in an accident, you deserve an advocate. Call 801-355-5550 or visit UtahAdvocates.com. Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Well, today I'm coming at you from a very different place than I typically am. I normally record the show in the podcasting room of my house. However, today I'm coming at you from my hotel room at the Westin Anaheim in Orange, California. Right across from Disneyland, actually. So spent a couple days over spring break at Disneyland with my kids and just had a lot of fun. And a funny little thought that I had about halfway through the first day was that I had more photos on my phone of plants and plant combinations than I did of anything else at Disneyland. So I thought that that was very telling. It's so inspiring to walk around, though, and just see all the beautiful planters and the way that they group different plant material and just the combinations. happens. And especially when it's a time of year when things are just barely waking up in Utah and where we live. When I left the house, just watering a whole bunch of stuff before we left. I've got my peas coming up. I've got some radishes and spinach and some lettuce that I'd planted that seem to be doing pretty good. I hope they still are. And it's just so fun to see those perennials just peeking out of the ground and all that kind of stuff. But when you transport yourself somewhere else that's in a totally different climate, it's such kind of a shock, So I'm sitting here looking out my hotel room window at some beautiful palm trees, and it's just a fun change of pace, especially when you're into plants. But one of the things that I thought was so cool, and they've done this for a long time, but just to see it again was neat, in Disneyland, in Tomorrowland, how they use food as the plant materials. So I know that they had one bed that was all artichokes, and they're actually quite pretty. They do look a little bit like thistle, but it was really beautiful. The whole center was artichokes, and some of them were blooming and some of them were smaller. And then they had, I believe, sage plant just kind of surrounding that. And then they had other planter beds that was nothing but just beautiful rows of Swiss chard and cabbages. And they used a lot of mint and thyme and just so many different herbs, rosemary, you name it. But it was just so pretty to see them in mass plantings all around one another. It was very, very interesting. So it's just pretty inspiring to see what they do. And I was really curious because I'm kind of a nerd. I was really curious what they were going to do in Star Wars Land because we haven't been there yet since it's opened. So it was neat to walk around and see what they chose to put around Star Wars. And it was what you would expect, I assume. A lot of arid looking plants, lots of succulents, aloes, and really large, types of plants like that. But the one thing that I thought they did extremely well was they would, if there was just a little bit of color in some of those plants, maybe some pokers or some other flowers like that, they would light them up really neat. So, but not a lot of use of color, but a ton of just arid looking plants, but all bulked together to make it look really lush. But the lighting was what really made it stand out. So anyway, just super inspired walking around Disneyland. And of course, they've got beautiful combinations of snapdragons and allium and pansies and just, phenomenal and really inspiring groupings of plants. And the one thing that I took away from it that I know that Cameron Alcott's talked about a lot is it was simple with just mass plantings of a few amount of things. So if it was just annuals, they would only have no more than 3 different colors going on. Obviously, they all, for the most part matched in just kind of the color wheel. But there was just maybe 3 plants total as far as the type of plant, but just in mass plantings. And that was what I think really stood out the most. And of course, excellent use of spacing and also, height of plants. So if the plants were really tall, they would either have them right in the center and then they would, group the smaller plants around the edges and make, kind of a tall portion in the middle, or they would, just put the taller plants in the back. And it was just all very, it was very formed and just aesthetically pleasing. Anyway, just super inspiring to walk around. And, I got to say that, being from Utah and not having citrus trees grow around us, it is kind of fun to be sitting in a restaurant and above you is a grapefruit tree with grapefruits that are, almost ready to pick right above you. It's just so fun to see grapefruits on trees. I have lived in Northern California in the past, and I did have a lemon and a lemon tree, which was pretty cool. And there is seriously nothing better than walking out to your yard and picking a fresh citrus and bringing it inside. It's pretty cool. No different than, of course, in Utah when we can go out and pick apples or plums or, pears or peaches, whatever we've got on our fruit trees. Or, of course, coming up in a couple months, tomatoes and peppers and all the other fun things that we plant in our gardens. Anyway, so that's kind of what's going on with me, just sitting here in my hotel room, all inspired about and excited for the upcoming growing season in Utah. And we will be bringing you guys all along the way to keep you in the know of what to do at any time. Okay, so today's episode is a Q&A. I have been asking you guys, what are your spring gardening questions? And we're going to get those answered for you today. Okay, this message comes in from Jennifer M. off of Instagram. She asked, is it too early to plant pansies? No, it is not too early to plant pansies. You can get pansies in now. It's the perfect time. Actually, they love to get planted in the spring or even in the fall. They quite often can survive a winter. So pansies can definitely withstand any of our cold temperatures that we're probably still going to be coming up. So get after it and get those pansies in the ground. They can tolerate a light frost just after planting. And you're just going to want to make sure to keep them watered. That's, I think, the biggest trick and why a lot of pansies fail is we get them in the ground. And since our irrigation systems aren't running, they can be forgotten to water them. So if your pansies don't seem to be doing well, just try watering them more. So yes, Jennifer, get those pansies in the ground. And there's so many beautiful selections in the stores right now. So get after it. Next question is from Blake Z. Blake asks, is it too early to plant tomatoes and peppers? Yes, it definitely is too early. So those are definitely warm season vegetables. They will get frostbitten anytime between now and mid-May. So really, depending on where you live in Utah, you're going to want to find out what your last frost date is. And typically, in a lot of areas, it's around Mother's Day weekend. So that's just a guide for when you can get the plants in the ground. Obviously, you need to watch the weather because we can get a late freeze, which can really impact your vegetables. So it's too early, but you're going to want to wait about 6 weeks. So hopefully you didn't plant them from seed and they're too big and need to get into the ground. But even if you see them in the garden centers, which you will over the next couple weeks, they cannot be outside at night. So you're going to want to make sure that if you do buy them, you're bringing them in at night or that you've got some kind of protection in your yard. Maybe you've got a hoop house over your raised garden box, or maybe you're using wall of waters. But until about mid-May, depending on where you live, of course, it's just not safe to get your tomatoes and peppers in the ground just yet. Okay, this question is from our Facebook page. This is Jenica asking, Jana, what do I put in raised garden boxes? My husband just gifted me an early Mother's Day present, how cool, of 2 raised garden boxes. I'm so excited to get started. What do I need to put inside them to give them the best start? Okay, so we actually had this very question last year with some experts from Q&R Box Gardens. I don't think they're in business right now as we speak, but they answered this question last year in an episode, and I think I'm just going to let them answer it now.
Yeah, that's a really great question because if you just drive to the nursery and you buy enough bags of Miracle-Gro to fill it up, that first of all, it's not going to give you quite the results that you're hoping for, and it is going to cost you a pretty penny. And so we recommend a couple of things when we are explaining how to fill these. And the first is that when you place your box garden wherever you want it to be, you want to make sure that your irrigation, if you're going to have irrigation come up through the middle, just have that done right off the bat beforehand. And if you're very concerned about ground pests, you're going to want to put down maybe some wire mesh or something underneath to keep anything from burrowing up. And then once you get to the filling of it, actually, we recommend that you start with a good amount of compostable, easy to break down yard waste. If you've got some tree trimmings, if you've got just your standard compost that you have working in your yard, and you're going to start to fill a large bulk of the bottom of the box with those type of materials, with the anticipation that those are going to break down over time, and over the next several years, you're going to end up with a lot of nice base layer compost in the bottom of your box. From that point, you're going to want to fill it with whatever soil you want to use, whether that's a combination of vermiculite or peat moss or whatever it is that you have decided is going to be the best fit for what you want to plant. You're going to fill that up. But we also then recommend that you leave 6 to 8 inches unfilled towards the top of your box. And the reason for that is that if you are going to do very young plants or even from seeds in your box, having a small 6 to 8 inch windbreak really allows them to be protected and sheltered for those first really crucial weeks until they can get rooted and start growing. And once they can grow up over the edge of the box, they're going to have a nice root system that's going to allow them to continue growing once they're hitting a little bit more of that wind and a little bit more exposure. I think you guys maybe know a little bit more about it, but sourcing dirt can be hard for people, and it's been hard for us too. I mean, it can be hard to just find someone to go buy large amounts of dirt from sometimes. I know, Rhett, you've talked to some people about it. Is there anything that solid enough that you want to add to that?
So yeah, I've talked to a few people about sourcing dirt, and it is a little bit tricky to find, like inexpensively. I know that landfills sometimes will make their own compost just from yard waste that people bring. The only problem with that, I would say, is you want to make sure you check with them and see what kind of like materials are going into this. Sometimes they'll have like microplastics in their soil, and you don't want that in your garden. So I would say always check with the landfill first and make sure they're not putting any sort of like unorganic material into that compost mix itself. But if it is an all natural compost mix, the landfills do sell it for very cheap, and it is like, if I remember right, it's like $5 a truckload or something like that. Very, very cheap.
Yeah, I think the biggest tip that I would have for our listeners is just don't fill it with the dirt from your yard at all. Because you're really wanting to take advantage of the fact that you can curate your own soil. I think for me, what I did was I layered the bottom with just all the, we just kind of saved up our lawn clippings and, normal things that would go out to the compost. And then we layered a whole bunch of we mulched up our Christmas tree and a whole bunch of other wood that we had cut down from the yard and put that at the bottom. And I actually did layer it with cardboard as well. I don't like to layer with landscape fabric. Our listeners know I am not a fan of landscape fabric in any way. It kills the dirt. So I don't like to cover that up. But cardboard is a great just sort of weed barrier. And I do highly suggest, like you mentioned, if you do have like moles, voles, or any other kind of weird pests, to definitely put maybe some hardware cloth around the bottom. And when I say hardware cloth, it's wire. That you would use for like chicken coops and that kind of a thing. But anyway, and then what I did for me is after I kind of layered the bottom, and it was kind of like a filler, with just compost and yard waste and anything that I could find that was organic. Then I just used a mixture of peat moss, vermiculite, and compost. This question is from Mike J on our Instagram. He says, Jana, what is the difference between hybrid seeds, heirloom seeds, non-GMO seeds, etc.? What is best to buy? Well, okay, this is also reminding me of a past episode when I talked with Parker Garlitz of True Leaf Market, and he explained this very thing. So let's listen to him answer it right now.
Yeah, great question. We deal with this. We deal with that a lot as a seed company. Let me just hit the GMO question first. All of the seed that we sell is non-GMO, and of course we advertise it that way. And we do get, in social media and things, we get people accusing us of being, fear mongers and hitting the non-GMO thing. It's not so much because, we're taking a firm stance one way or the other. We would leave that to people to decide for themselves. But so many people who are concerned about GMOs don't really understand how the GMO seed industry works. And here's an easy answer. How do you know that your seed is non-GMO? If you didn't have to sign a contract with Monsanto or Seminis or Syngenta or Bayer or any of those big, gigantic agribusiness companies to buy the seed, then it's probably non-GMO, because there's just not that many varieties of seeds that are genetically modified. They're going for big money crops like corn and soy. And as a general rule, I don't think you're going to find a GMO kohlrabi. It just doesn't exist. There's not enough money in it. Nobody wants to modify a turnip because there's not enough money in that crop. So all the seeds we have are non-GMO. And what's the difference? I guess the question is, what's the difference between a GMO crop and a hybrid crop? Well, every vegetable, every plant that you eat is a hybrid of some other plant at some point, right? Like the magic idea is cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower and mustard, and they're all brassica. They're all descended from the same plant Brussels sprouts. There you go.
Right? Yes.
They're all the same plant. They've been hybridized to the point that you don't realize that they have a common ancestor, right? And that's all natural. It happens naturally when, bees and butterflies cross-pollinate. So a hybrid seed is cross-pollinated manually with little brushes or Q-tips or whatever in a greenhouse where they keep the bees out, so there's no accidental cross-pollination. So a hybrid seed is kind of natural hybridized, right? It's not happening with a microscope and a lab and gene splicing or whatever. So GMOs are in the lab, hybrids are natural. So, but with hybrid seed, it's a little tricky, and we'll distinguish hybrid seed versus open pollinated seed. So a hybrid seed, it's easier to think about dogs, and an example with dogs that everybody would be familiar with, like a Labradoodle, right, is a cross between a Labrador and a poodle. So you get this cool looking Labradoodle, but if you breed two Labradoodles together, what will you get? Will you get another Labradoodle, or you'll get, who knows what you're going to get? You might get a poodle, you might get a lab, you might get any degree. So that third generation is not going to be a reliable reflection of a Labradoodle parent. Does that make sense? And the same thing happens with hybrid seeds. So you have variety of tomato A and variety of tomato B, and you hybridize them. Well, that seed is going to grow a very reliable tomato with certain characteristics. Maybe it's cold weather tolerant, or maybe it's disease resistant or drought resistant or whatever. And then if you harvest seeds from that tomato and plant those, you're not going to get the same kind of characteristics in that subsequent generation. So that's a hybrid. An open pollinated seed is seeds that will produce the same characteristic generation after generation if you harvest and save the seeds, if that kind of makes sense.
Okay, and so is that any different than heirloom then?
Yeah, so heirloom is a fun question. What's the definition of heirloom? It depends on who you ask, right? So an heirloom seed is by definition an open pollinated seed, but depending on who you ask, some seed companies will say if it's open pollinated, meaning reliable characteristics generation after generation, it is therefore automatically heirloom, while other companies, and I think we're in the other companies camp, for us, we don't label a seed heirloom unless we have experience. We've been in business since 1974. So what is that? That's going on, we're coming up on 50 years. So if we don't have experience with that variety of seed, or otherwise know for a fact that it's been around, at least your grandparents planted that seed, we don't call it heirloom.
Oh, wow.
Right? So for us, heirloom is open pollinated that has been around for many decades. If that's the case, then we will go ahead and label that's an heirloom seed. And in some cases, there's heirlooms that you can find in, seed catalogs dating back to the 1800s that have been around for a long, long, long time.
Wow.
That's the difference for us. So open pollinated doesn't necessarily mean heirloom for us, but you'll find other seed companies that have a more liberal definition.
860 KKAT with Jenna Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time.
We are supported by ProgressivePlant.com. They are the experts that the professionals go to for all things plants. Progressive Plants has over 1 million plants at their 100-acre nursery up in Copperton, and you can shop those plants from right at home. Visit ProgressivePlants.com today.
It's the Gardening Utah Proven Winners ColorChoice Shrub of the Week. Here's Cameron Alcott with Progressive Plants.
What is old is new again. A longtime favorite harbinger of spring, the forsythia has wonderful yellow blooms and is one of the first flowering plants of the year. Older cultivars get a little bit more wild and gangly, but the show-off starlet from Proven Winners ColorChoice Shrubs is a dwarf version that requires virtually no maintenance. It's deer resistant and puts out a huge display of yellow gold flowers that steals the show in the early part of spring. It's ideal for poor soils and smaller lots where the traditional forsythia varieties simply won't fit. If you do decide to prune, which hopefully you don't need to, make sure it's done after it blooms. And if you prune in late fall or early spring, you are snipping off all of your flowers. This is a wonderful plant for the landscape and is such a good performer for the early part of the year.
Look for the Proven Winners white containers at progressiveplants.com or at your local garden center. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Okay, this question is from Nick T, and he said, when planting my tomatoes this year, what companion plants can I put with them to help them grow better? Will planting marigolds help? Okay. This is a very common thought and question. So I'm going to have Liz Hamilton, my good friend, answer this question. We talked about this in a really fun episode, and actually it's one of our top episodes. It's called Garden Myths Debunked. It's episode 35, and let's listen to Liz's answer to this question.
They did a study. Marigolds don't prevent anything except one variety of nematode, which is soil-borne. So there is, it does prevent one type of nematode.
Okay, what does that nematode feed on?
I don't know. I didn't read that far into it. I just laughed. But they did find that it repelled one type of nematode.
Okay, so that being said, that's another myth there then. There's so many YouTube videos and anything, magazine articles to plant marigolds with your tomatoes. But do those nematodes attack tomatoes? If that's,
I don't know. I didn't read the whole thing. I should have. I will say this, so marigolds aren't a very tall plant. There are some that are tall. You can buy like waist high marigolds and things like that. Not that most of us grow those, but you'll see like, oh, they repel aphids, or oh, they do this, or oh, they do that. And I'm like, my tomato plant's 6 foot tall. How is my 2 foot tall or lower marigold doing anything for the top of this plant? Aphids are windborne. Aphids fly. Like, they're not crawling up the stem and finding my plant. And so I think there's a lot of like, or I've heard the one, like, they can smell the marigolds and they don't come. There's not too many insects out there with a very acute sense of smell, or they're like genetically can smell one or two things like their food sources, but they're not smelling, like they're not out there being repelled by other scents.
Yeah, if this was one of those myths that were true, I'm thinking to myself, like, I've grown like hundreds of thousands of marigolds in my greenhouse and I still get aphids on the plants. So I'm like, no.
Yeah. Or like or people will just like blanket statement, they repel insects. And I'm like, have you seen what happens when they get into the earwigs? The earwigs will eat marigolds to the ground and there's a nub and there's nothing.
Yeah.
Earwigs love marigolds.
Overnight, you'll walk out and they're gonzo.
Yeah. Or like, this is horrifying when you go out at night with the flashlight and you'll shine across it, and where your marigold is, it's like a black moving shiny
good Lord,
like group of nasty earwigs all in there eating it. Like, that's not repelling anything right now.
This is giving me a bad memory of this very summer this happened to me.
Yeah. You shine, you're like, what is that? And it's like, oh, it's like 8,000 earwigs eating this marigold plant. Yeah, that's what
I think what happens.
Yes.
I think what happens a lot of times with like a lot of these like myths, or even marketing for like a lot of products that you see at the store and stuff, are basically interpretations of scientific conclusions that have been had. But they're like, oh, wait, we can maybe make this into a thing and make some money off of it, because we're a capitalist society. Like, I get it. We're going to prey upon the ignorance of people to make money. Yeah, who wouldn't do that, other than the 3 people that are on this call right now. So,
that's right.
So, the one that I really look at is like mycorrhiza. We've seen a lot of stuff about like mycorrhizas, being sold or whatever. It's like, you have to inoculate your plant with mycorrhiza in order for it to grow. Yes, the mycorrhiza is a beneficial fungus that attaches to the roots that helps, with the uptake of like nitrogen and other nutrients. It's a very symbiotic relationship. Now, what is not really conveyed is that there are typically very specific mycorrhizas for very specific species of plants. So when you buy
it's a symbiotic relationship. All mycorrhizae are not created equal for all plants.
Exactly. So just because you went and got a bucket of mycorrhiza from someplace because they said it was going to help your plants, doesn't necessarily mean that what's in that bucket is going to be there or is appropriate for that particular plant.
Or this environment. Maybe it doesn't even
or
live
the environment.
You know?
Right.
You're just putting dead fungus in your hole, which might actually like the anaerobic dead bacteria and stuff. Like maybe it helps that way, but it's not doing anything for your roots.
Right. And there have been studies upon studies upon studies about how mycorrhiza is actually like really only going to be like really beneficial when the plant is exposed to it at a seedling stage, so that the mycorrhiza can grow along with the plant. Like once it's already at an adult phase, like it doesn't really spread that way because it has to spread on the cell walls of the roots. So like it doesn't really quite work the way that people think it does, because there's been no scientific evidence that supports like late life inoculation actually improves plant health. And they've actually found that there's like almost no difference at all. So it's just one of those things, like if it's inoculated at the seedling stage, like if you had a cutting, yes, but later on, doesn't really matter.
Got it.
So it was just like one of the few scientific papers that I've actually read.
Okay, this message came in on Instagram from the username CrabAppy. The question is there certain things that I should bury in the ground when I plant my roses or tomatoes? My grandmother always told me to bury a fish head with my roses or banana peels with my tomatoes. What's the truth? Now, this is something that we tackled with Liz Hamilton in a Garden Myths Debunked episode. I believe this was episode 34, and I'm going to let Liz answer it right now.
If you're burying a banana peel or a fish head or whatever, I mean, it will eventually compost and be food. But I don't know that you're getting any like extra potassium for that plant, which is great. I mean, I think so. Okay. So let's say you're burying the banana or using banana juice that you've made, whatever that means, to get potassium to get blooms. Okay. So if you're planting your banana or you're planting your rose with the banana, probably unlikely that the rose is going to do much blooming in that first year anyway, and it's going to biodegrade over time anyway. And so I think that any perceived higher levels of potassium that would be there would be gone by the time that plant is really utilizing it. So it doesn't really seem like, I mean, I don't know that I have any specific studies or anything like that, but just in terms of logistics, it doesn't seem like it would really make a difference one way or another. You could put an NPK fertilizer on it and probably have a higher dose of potassium if the plant even needed it in their first year. Like some roses don't even do that. And then as far as like letting it ferment for several days, there's some evidence out there, because then you're getting into the myth potentially of compost teas, right? We ferment our comfrey, we ferment our cow poop, we do these things, and then we boil it all together, and then we pour it on our plants. And there is some evidence out there, that these things do actually some of the stuff that they're purported to do. Like a lot of people use compost tea actually as an insecticide and not as a fertilizer. I don't know if you've heard that, but you make a compost tea and you spray it on your roses and then it prevents black spot. And which is fungal, sometimes bacterial, depending on which black spot you have specifically, but there is some evidence out there that it does prevent those things. Replication has been not 100% in terms of that experiment, but they have been done, and there has been some evidence out there that does work as an organic option for certain fungal infections. But in terms of like making any compost teas as a fertilizer, at that point, I mean, if you were to measure those things, I think the NPK in that would be pretty much negligible. it's always good to water your plants. Any NPK is going to be beneficial. But like if you're at a 1-1-1 or like a 0-1-1 or something like that, like what was the point of keeping a stinky banana in your garage for 5 days while you let it ferment?
Exactly.
Ugh, not great.
Yeah.
The other thing I have heard is that if you do these things and you make these compost teas, and you can buy like aerobic boilers for these things. Have you seen those on the interwebs? Like you can buy a boiler for your compost tea and you aerate it and let it like boil for a couple of days. And what that is supposed to do, and which it may do, is create like a bacterial colony, like lots of good bacteria in there. And so that when you put it on the garden, you're introducing lots of like beneficial microbes. But I think what people don't always understand is that like most bacterias and fungus and protozoa and things like that, they're environmental specific. So things that are living and growing in your brew compost tea that you've got going on in your backyard, as soon as you end up pouring them onto the ground, they're probably going to die.
Yeah.
They're probably not going to make it because they're not sitting around in their compost sludge getting aerated, over and over and over again in their fermenting whatever. Sugars are happening, bacteria are eating them. We're building a colony, sure, but it's a colony that lives in your compost tea mess, not the garden, not the soil, not in that same environment. Now you could argue that all these dead protozoa and dead bacteria that ultimately won't make it within an hour after you pour it all out into the garden is fertilizer. There's that. I mean, maybe there's a benefit there, and I don't know that that's been studied, but again, like you're not making this amazing brew that's going to end up on the soil that's going to like do these things for your plants because everything you brewed up is going to die when it hits the soil.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, along those lines, speaking of hitting the soil, coffee grounds. We hear that all the time. Mix them into the soil. It'll impact your pH.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
There's also you can tie in with that the myth of pine needles as well. Coffee grounds and pine needles. You put the pine bark mulch and the pine needles and the coffee grounds, and then you'll have acidic soil or you'll change the pH. And I will just say we are an average in Utah. Our pH is about 7.0 at most places in the valley. Some places it's a little higher, some places a little lower, but 7.0 is the average, which puts us on the high side. And anything above that is higher and higher. And I actually came up with this on my own to explain it to people. I didn't read this anywhere. I feel excited about this analogy. But when you go and you add like sulfur or any of these things like elemental sulfur that are proven to lower pH on certain things, and you scatter it around your plants and stuff like that, it's like adding a few drops of fresh water into the ocean and expecting to get a glass of fresh water. It's never going to happen because we are an ocean of high pH. And if you amend and you amend and you amend and you amend in a yard that is all high pH, maybe if you're lucky in like that little square foot area, you can get the pH to lower a little bit over time, but you're not. We water with high pH water. We already have a high pH soil. Like you're not going to amend your way down in your tiny postage stamped yard or your tiny one garden bed down to an acceptable level for something that needs an acidic soil. The exception to that would be if you had like a raised bed that's separated from everything else and you can put things in there that is just high pH. But again, you're going to end up watering, or low pH, but again, you're going to end up watering it with high pH soil. So over time, it will eventually strip that acidity out, and you'll need to continue amending even in raised bed situations over time to correct the issue. So that being said, back to coffee grounds and pine needles. Pine needles have if they are green and they fall off the tree green, they actually have an acidity, if I remember correctly, of 3.0. It's high, very high, or low, I guess you would say low, very high acidity. I believe, if I remember correctly from what I was reading, and of course different species are going to be different, but the pinus that was used for that particular sample in a study that I was looking at, the fresh green, they're actually 3.0, which is very low or very high acidity, however you want, low pH, high acidity, however you want to look at that. And so, but once they fall off the tree or the tree gets mowed down and crushed up, they die. And the acidity of dead needles that are no longer attached to anything, or dead bark or dead arborist chips, is a neutral, actually. It's not acidic at all. So it's a 6.0. It's right in there. And so if you're anticipating a 3 because you're trying to lower your acidity levels, it's actually a 6. Maybe it's a 3 right at, if you like get a super fresh tree and you're grinding them right into your soil, but it's not staying. It's going to degrade down to a 6. And so then you're looking at a neutral. So then you're just trying to lower 1 pH below. And then when you're constantly already watering with a high pH water and you're stripping that soil out, pine isn't really doing anything for you. And then people will say, well, I thought plants didn't live under pine trees because they have high acidity under the soil from years of pine needle drop. Which is another myth. If you take samples of dirt that are under pine trees, they're actually not acidic. What reason why most things don't grow under pine trees is because they have an evergreen canopy that's year round. That's really dense depending on the tree that you are working with, and it blocks light. So already off the bat, you have a really low light situation. And the other thing is pines and conifers in general don't actually develop a taproot. There's no gigantic taproot that goes into the ground that's anchoring that tree into place. So what you have is a very fine network of feeder roots and surface roots. And I think if I've read correctly, it's like 2 feet and up is the root system. Have you ever tried to dig under a really well-established pine tree? It's impossible, right? Like the dirt's hard, there's roots everywhere. And then imagine, if you've ever seen it, when like a blue spruce is picked up by the wind and turned over and falls down. Yeah. Is there a giant taproot? Is there like an old stump that's there on the ground? Or is it just come up in a giant disc and then sit there? It's a disc because that's where the roots are. So you have these feeder roots that are competing for water, and there is no sunlight. So there's not a lot of water falling through these dense canopies either. So there's not much water underneath there. There's no sunlight. And then what little water does get through, that tree is scrounging for it in the top 2 feet of soil all the way around it. And so it's really just not an ideal place to plant plants anyway, unless you're planning to water really heavily, which you can do, and you can see things thrive there. I have seen beautiful gardens under conifers, but there's usually either it's in a high humidity area or it's in a place where somebody is dumping a lot of water into that garden space. Yeah. So it's not the acidity. Soil tests have shown us over and over again that they're not acidic under that in non-acidic areas. So, and then the other one is coffee grounds, right? And we were kind of touching on that. And so used coffee grounds, again, after they've been boiled and leached into your coffee, are at a 6. They're neutral. They're not at a high acidic pH. And of course, there are variables, right? Like, did you run a full pot of coffee that day? Maybe there's still some acidity left in there. And did you, like how, I don't know. There's things like that. You can water with coffee. Yeah. And you could use non-used coffee grounds that might provide some kind of upper acidity level. I do take my used coffee grounds and put them, I have a raised bed that is full of peat moss and vermiculite and nothing else. And I grow blueberries in those raised beds. Right. And I've been pretty successful with those blueberries. But I amend every single year with elemental sulfur, and I water with acidifying water once a week when they're actively growing. So I am continuously amending with that. And then I mulch every year with shredded leaves, which can help with acidity, and with more peat. So I bury more peat on top of that. So what's percolating down is still acidic. Peat has a resting acidity of 4. Okay. So peat is highly acidic. Yeah. And so, I amend in other ways, but Coffee grounds are a great source of organic material. They're good to add to your compost. It's not necessarily a negative thing. And my thought process is, even though there is zero science to back this up, and it's just a professional, thing that I do, or non-professional thing that I do, I should say, is I take those coffee grounds and I do layer them out on top of the soil in between my peat and things like that, because my thought process is that if there is any coffee left in there that didn't get brewed out, then it's percolating down into my garden beds, which might be acidic. Maybe it's not. And if nothing else, if there's zero acidity and there's nothing to it, then at least I've added organic matter back into the soil, and that's fine too.
Yeah, and the reality is it's not going to hurt anything.
Right. Like there's probably nothing to it. Studies have shown used coffee grounds is 6.0, but like, who studied every piece of used coffee ground? I don't know. I'm going to contradict all the science that I purport on other things, but my thought process is that it won't hurt anything.
Well, that is all the time we have for Q&A today, but you can always submit your questions on our Instagram at Gardening Utah. You can either send me a text message on there, or you can also send me an audio message. If you'd like your voice on the podcast, just hit the microphone button and record your question, and I'll put it here on the podcast and we'll answer it in the next episode.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast. Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.
We are supported by ProgressivePlants.com. They are the experts that the professionals go to for all things plants. Progressive Plants has over 1 million plants at their 100-acre nursery up in Copperton. And you can shop those plants from right at home at ProgressivePlants.com. They are your neighbor's next door and experts at helping you choose the perfect and unique plants that will thrive in your location. Progressive Plants is passionate about helping homeowners, expert gardeners, novices alike choose the correct plant for your soil. They don't just grow plants, they know plants. Let Progressive Plants help you today. Just go to ProgressivePlants.com. Visit ProgressivePlants.com today.